you're from Canada, right?
That's
And
correct.
a lot of students ask me if Canadian English and American English are different things. And then there's North American English. And so they both kind of get put in this category. Um, but what do you think are some of the differences in how people speak, in language?
Yeah, it's a great question. And for all my students watching, they know I'm proud to be Canadian. I don't advertise to my students too often. I'm from Canada just to not confuse them because of that exact thing. Because I find students are like, well, what is Canadian English? I don't know if I want to learn Canadian English. So I always tell my students, I'm from Canada. I teach American English. And sometimes I put in brackets North American English because Canada is obviously in North America. Now, from a practical perspective, I personally do not think there are differences between Canadian and American English that warrant it being categorized as something different. Because in British English, there are definitely real differences in grammatical structures, vocabulary, things like that. I would not be able to teach British English because I don't speak it. And then, of course, there's the pronunciation, the accent is quite different. Now, American and Canadian English, they share the exact same grammatical structures, vocabulary. There's no difference in that regard. There are, of course, some differences in pronunciation, but Canada is a huge country. The US is a huge country, and there's different regional differences in pronunciation among both countries. So I don't see that being unique to Canadian English versus American English. It's just where you live geographically within North America.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah. And I'm sure a lot of people haven't really thought about it that way. So that's really cool. Um, Maybe there's some words or like pronunciate specific things that come to mind that are a little different.
Well, I don't know if you heard it, but there is a stereotype that Canadians say the word about very differently. And I have never met a Canadian that actually pronounces it as a boot, but perhaps you have. But there is this like comical stereotype. It's on Saturday Night Live or other late night comedy shows. Whenever they make fun of a Canadian, they always say a boot. What you talking a boot? But I've never heard a Canadian say that before.
That's funny. Yeah, I've heard that stereotype. I have. Um, and it's funny when I was going through my teacher training, I don't, when was that? 2009, and there was a girl there from Minnesota who was in our group, and she had these things that are kind of what Americans associate with Canadian English, but it's really like the Great Lakes region. Um, and so she would say something, and the British, counselor or teacher, he would sometimes be like, "What? That doesn't sound right," because he hadn't heard that before. But that was really interesting. And yeah, it's not just Canada, and Canada's so big, like you pointed, it's bigger than the United States.
Yeah, bigger, of course, geographically, but insignificant in terms of population. Canada is such a tiny country. So our level of influence in the language is so small. We just basically do what our neighbors are doing and take our cues from American English.
Are there some spelling differences too?
Yeah, so that's kind of a weird thing, to be honest, is that so Canada used to be part of the Commonwealth, or I guess technically still is. So under British rule. So we used British spelling rules. But since we're so distant from them geographically, we never adopted their pronunciation or their vocabulary or grammar because we're just so close to the United States, because Canada is a very young country as well compared to the US and obviously to Britain. So for some reason, we adopted their spelling rules, but it's very, very minor. For example, we add a U in color. So words that end in OR, we add a U to them for the British ones. But
Like favorite, is that also one? Favorite?
yeah, exactly, exactly. But personally, since I do teach American English, I do not do that.
Okay.
So I just don't write that way. But there is like a spell checker. If you use Canadian, the spell checker, it will add that extra U for you. But aside from that U on the spelling, I can't identify any other spelling differences.
Cool. And as a US person, I shouldn't say American, I think, because it's the term American is so like has so many things attached to it sometimes, like especially my friends from South America or from Central America, they're like,
Like,
well,
I'm
we're American
American.
too. And you're Canadian, America, it's all right, North and South America. So as a US person, uh living abroad, growing up, I would be in these situations where people would basically tell me, like, if you want to be safe, tell people that you're from Canada, not from the US, because a lot of people don't like the US. And so they would tell me, you'll be safer telling people that you're Canadian. And so I always had this idea traveling, and I know a lot of Americans, maybe have you heard this from Americans before?
Yeah, I have heard that as well. I've heard that Americans will put a Canadian flag on their backpack or something like that
Yeah.
so when they're traveling, travelers, they often wear backpacks. So if tourists see there's a Canadian flag on it, they'll treat them better than they would if they had assumed they were American. But I have heard that as a stereotype. I have no idea how many Americans actually do that, and I have no idea if it's effective or not. But I have heard that as a common stereotype.
Yeah, I think a lot of people say it, but yeah, I don't think it's effective. I had a
Yeah.
situation in Russia, and my Russian friend called the Canadian guy American. He's like, "No, I'm not American. I'm Canadian." And he's like, "Oh, it's the same thing." And so, like,
Oh,
for
yeah.
some people, it's just like, "Oh, that's the same. They're the same."
Yeah, exactly. And I guess it totally depends on their cultural influences, like what they learn in Russia versus what they learn maybe in France or something about Canada versus the US. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure how that stereotype or that reference that, oh, just put a Canadian flag and people will treat you better. I do know culturally we have a reputation for being very friendly. And but there's so many cultural differences between Canada in the sense that we're such a young country. We didn't have a revolution. We were just formed very, politically. I assign you as Canada. So we don't come from having like a background of violence or anything like that. So I perhaps it's just easier for us to be a little more friendly because we don't have that within our culture.
Cultural baggage. Oh,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, give us some time. We're young. Give us some time. I'm sure we'll have our own baggage eventually.
that's cool.